I'd like to thank Sew Tights for sponsoring this video. Do you need to bind a quilt? Do you hate making those sharp corners on your quilt? And how do I get those candy cane stripes to appear on the sides? In today's quilting tutorial, we are diving into bias binding, a fundamental technique that can take your quilting projects to the next level. We'll cover how to make it, when to use it, and how to make them pop. So stick with me and I'll show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Karen Brown of Just Get It Done Quilts. I give you tips, tricks, and strategies to help you make the quilt that you want to make. I am getting so close to the 400,000 milestone. So if you like what you see, please support the channel by clicking that subscribe button. Quilt binding is that final fabric border that covers the raw edges of your quilt sandwich, providing that nice, clean, finished look. Not only is it practical, it also gives you another opportunity to add an aesthetic element to your quilt. If you have never bound a quilt before, I'm going to suggest you start off with this video here. It covers the basics like how to attach a binding, how to turn corners, and how to join the two strips together. This video is all about bias binding, and it's the 5th installment in my binding series. Bias binding is one of those big divides in quilting. You either use it all the time or you never bother. But it doesn't need to be so polarizing. Let me show you why there is a place and a purpose for both. Strips of fabric cut parallel to the selvages, also known as length of grain, have very little stretch, and some say they are ideal for quilt binding as they have few joins. But the cutting of long strips is fussy and takes a lot of fabric, and most likely gives you a lot of leftovers. Most quilters make binding by using width of fabric strips, also called cross grain, because it's straightforward, all the strips are the same length, and it's the most economical way to make binding as it uses the least yardage. It has a bit of stretch, but it's easily managed if you use a walking foot. Bias binding is cut on the 45, which does make it fiddly, but it doesn't use as much fabric as the length of grain strips do. It also has the most joins, and the strips are all of different lengths. And it is very stretchy, which needs to be managed at every step. The flexibility of bias binding is not such a bad thing, as it is able to smoothly bind curved and scallop edges of your quilt. And I'll show you more about this in step 6. The bound edges of our quilts often wear faster than the piecing because of the friction in binding against the bed, the floor, and our bodies. A binding that has been cut parallel to either grain has only a few threads at the fold, and when one breaks through wear and tear, it will open along the edge, exposing the batting underneath. I checked with Hannah Kelly on this, and she had plenty of examples of frayed binding. With bias binding, at the edge the threads cross, so the friction is spread over multiple strands, which means it's more resistant to wear. And if breakage does occur, it travels down the side of the binding and not the edge. Cutting strips on the 45 can also bring a new design element to your project, as any directional motifs will now twirl along the edge. We often call these candy cane or barbershop stripes. You can have a strong or light effect depending on your choice of fabric. There are a couple of different ways to cut bias strips, and which one you use might depend on how much you need. This first method is great when you're using with like a yard of fabric or more. Fold your piece of fabric on the 45, then turn it so that the fold is parallel to the horizontal lines on your cutting mat. If you have a large enough cutting mat, you can cut your strips perpendicular to this fold. If you do not have the space, fold your fabric along a vertical line, then fold the fabric down along a horizontal line, then cut your fabric into 2.5-inch strips. 1 yard made all these strips, and they can easily be sewn together since they're already cut on the 45. It doesn't matter if they're cut this way or that way, as long as they fit with the right sides together. You need to have just a small overhang on both sides. Then sew the ends together with a 1/4 inch seam. Press open. I like to roll my binding up as I press, so I end up with this great ball at the end. When you are working with smaller cuts, like a 1/2 yard or a fat 1/4, you first need to make a cut on the 45. With right sides together, a line along the selvages. Trim off the selvages and sew together with a 1/4 inch seam, then press open. Now we have this pennant-like shape, and we're going to identify the bias edge and mark it with a pin or a piece of tape. From here, you can choose one of 3 methods. First, you can cut the fabric vertically into 2.5 inch strips, then sew them together like we did in the previous method. Just note that you need to pay attention to which direction is the long bias side, and that's why we pin that edge. If you cut them the opposite way, you'll still get bias strips, but they'll be much shorter and some will have these squared ends. And hopefully, you just make that mistake once. Another method you can try is to mark your fabric with lines the width of your binding strips parallel to that bias edge. This next step is a bit awkward. We're going to take the side, not the biased edge, but the one that runs along the grain, and we're going to pin it together, but we're going to offset it by 1. It's a little bit awkward because there's not a nice fold in the fabric. And if your lines connect like this, then you're doing it right. Sew the seam at a 1/4 inch. From here, you take your sharpest scissors and cut on the lines until you have one long piece of binding. The third way that you can do this is a combination of the previous 2. Starting 2 inches in from the side, cut the strips at 2.5 inches, but stop 2 inches before the other side. We pin it together like we did before, offsetting it by 1. Sew the seam at a 1/4 inch. Then take your sharpest scissors and cut through from one side to the other until you have one long piece of binding. Personally, I prefer method number 1. I like to use a rotary cutter to make long, straight strips. I've made a jig so I can pin them together quickly, and I have a rhythm I get into as I sew the strips together. For me, I find using scissors on a long, accurate seam is hard on my hands. And method number 3 is just too fussy for me. But I know many quilters that find method number 1 fiddly. So experiment with the 3 methods and choose the one that works for you. Before we go to the next tip, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Sew Tights, and their new magnetic cutting system. Many of you have already seen me using this amazing product, as I have been test driving their mat and ruler for about a month now. I have used it to cut big and small pieces of fabric, thick binding and narrow sashing, long strips and really long strips. And you quickly realize as you're using these that this has been designed by quilters. First, the cutting mat fits a fat 1/4. And for those of us that buy fabric by the meter, it fits a fat 1/4 of one of those too. The ruler is also quilt friendly at 6.5 inches, with both the 1 inch and the 1/2 inch increments running along both the top and the bottom. I love the thin lines so I can accurately see where the edge of the fabric is. And the ends of the ruler are beveled so it's easier to pick up. I didn't even think that was an issue until I started using this. I could feel the ease in shifting and moving it. I didn't have to work so hard. The magic of this system is in the magnets. This ruler has 6. Plus, it comes with 12 additional boosters. For most cutting of width of fabric strips like binding, this is all you need. But if you are cutting through more layers or you're cutting through thicker material, you can use these boosters to hold your fabric firm. Now you might be thinking, what if I'm cutting something smaller or I want to use a specialty ruler? You just use the boosters, and you can use as many boosters as you want. These boosters can also hold your fabric in place. We're often dealing with the weight and the bulk of our fabric in projects. I find that I'm reaching for these boosters all the time to lend a hand. This is truly one of those products that you didn't know you needed. And now I have one. I am not giving it back. If you would like your own magnetic cutting system, follow the link in the video description below or go to sewtights.com. They have models for both left-handed and right-handed people, and you'll want to get yours before they're sold out. For a fuller, longer-lasting bias binding, you simply fold it in half and press. It is attached like regular binding, sewn at a 1/4-inch seam, and 2 layers rolled over the edge. Now, you might have heard the term single fold or double fold bias binding. Single fold is when you fold the 2 edges of the binding into the middle in half. And it's much easier to make if you have one of these guides. You feed it through and slowly, without stretching the strip, pull the fabric through while pressing with a hot iron. In quilting, we use single fold tape in quilt-as-you-go method that I showed you in this video here. It's also used in applique, like in stems or outlines. Double fold is when the single fold is folded again in half, one side being slightly shorter than the other. This flat binding is good for smaller projects, like placemats where you don't want bulky binding, or a project that will be lightly used, like a wall quilt. Some quilters use double fold in their quilt binding, but this method only leaves 1 layer of fabric along the edge. Bias binding is sewn to the quilt the same way standard binding is, with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, then flipped over and sewn on the other side, whether by machine or hand. It is very important that you do not pull on the binding while you sew because of its stretchiness. If you pull too hard, you can easily end up with a bowl effect. I avoid this by attaching all my binding with clips beforehand. This also gives me an opportunity to avoid joins in my corners. The fast and easy way to start and stop is the same as with regular binding. Open your binding first and square it off. Then fold on an angle and fold again. Sew around your quilt as normal. Then as you approach the end, trim your binding on the 45 so that there is an overlap of 1 inch at the seam. Then tuck it into the pocket. I find it easiest if I shift the tail over 1/8 of an inch when I complete the seam. So when it rolls over, the tail is snug in the pocket. Now, one of the main reasons to use bias binding is when you want to make a rounded corner or scalloped edge. Not only can either of these techniques take your quilt project to the next level, I know that there are many quilters that just hate making those sharp corners. There are many specialty rulers that you can buy specifically to make rounded corners and scallops, but I am just choosing a curve ruler that I already own. You can even use a plate or a bowl. Generally, the bigger the curve, the easier it is to sew around, so I'm choosing this one. Trim off the excess on all corners. You start your seam as you normally would. When you get to the curve, you don't need to do anything special, just don't pull. You might slow down a bit to keep the 1/4-inch mark consistent, but just don't pull. After you do a couple of these, you'll see how easy they are. You might never do a sharp corner again. Once you have completed the seam, just roll over the fabric on the edge. At those rounded corners, you'll see how easily that bias stretch accommodates those curves. You can finish it by hand or machine. Scalloped edges are just a combination of convex and concave curves. Again, there are specialty rulers for this, but I'm just going to use what I have. So I start by rounding all my corners. Then I took my ruler and some adding machine tape and made a template that I traced out with my rotary cutter. With convex curves, we need the stretch at the fold. And just like with rounded corners, if we don't pull, the bias will take care of the curve for us. With concave curves, it's the opposite. We need the stretch at the seam. So we need to pull a bit as we sew on this side of the scallop, both when we sew the seam and when we flip it over. And there you have it. Bias binding demystified. I hope this video helps you add that professional touch to your quilting projects. Remember, practice makes perfect, so don't get discouraged if your first attempts aren't flawless. With time and patience, you will master this skill. If you want to learn more about binding, the basics, making them thick or thin, or using up your scraps, check out my binding playlist here. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more tips, hacks, and inspiration. If you have any questions or you want to share your quilting experience, please leave a comment below. Take care, and I'll see you next time.